Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Walter Haydock. Walter, thanks for being here.
Chris, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, man, we've chatted. You've been on the show in the past, if I'm not mistaken. It's been quite a bit at this point. But that actually leads me to my first question. Is you've pivoted a bit recently. Like in the last time we talked, I had you on the show. You was a focus on AppSec and S-bombs and software supply chain and things like that. And the last, I'd say at least over a year at this point, you've went all in on AI governance, AI security, and I've been watching you thrive in that space, man. So I'm curious, like, what made you make the pivot and how's it been going?
Yeah, thanks for that. And definitely accurate description. So StackAware did a very public pivot in the summer of 2023 to focus on AI governance. And that's not because we lost any sort of confidence in our approach when it came specifically to vulnerability management. And in fact, we still use the product that we built for vulnerability management internally. You can look up penetration testing findings that have been remediated or determined to be not exploitable using our old tool. But from an entrepreneurial perspective, the customer isn't always right, but the market is always right. And the market was telling me that it was telling me two things. One, the biggest objection or the biggest reason why deals weren't closing with the previous product were, oh, I've got this audit I need to get through, or I need this compliance certification. That's what's really holding up the business here. And then the second thing that was happening was obviously the explosion in interest in generative AI. And I've actually had in my post-military career, I had a decision point where I wasn't sure if I was going to go and become a data scientist or go into security. And I had not a huge amount of experience, but more than just kind of middling level of experience playing around with, some of the mainly predictive, but also some generative AI tools back in the day prior to the launch of ChatGPT. And since I had an interest there, I saw the stars align and decided to pivot into AI governance, and then also go from primarily a product centric approach to a services approach, mainly because the services allow you to really validate the problem. And when you get really close to customers, then you understand every pain point, and it lets you build a product that is more valuable.
Yeah, so many things you said there are spot on. First off, I think timing is a big thing, right? Like the rapid explosion and growth of AI and AI adoption, it would be silly not to take advantage of that from a professional perspective, both individually, like we'll talk about later in terms of credentials and learning what you've done, but also professionally in terms of your organization, your company, and things like that. And then you talked about the pivot and what was it? The aspect of organizations rapidly adopting the technology, and I'm curious from your perspective, being on the front lines there, like working with these organizations around AI governance. You're seeing these issues firsthand, right? Of companies trying to, how do we keep up with the pace of the business, right? The business is rapidly adopting this technology. We don't really know where to start. There's a bunch of guidance out there, a lot of great stuff from OWASP and others, and we'll get into that too. But what are you seeing so far? Like as you work with these organizations, what are some of the common challenges? Things that people are maybe getting wrong, as they get going on this path.
Yeah. So the customers I work with are surprising in that they are in the top 10% of sophistication when it comes to AI governance. Originally, I thought that would be folks who kind of didn't really even know, what was going on, or, and realize that, there was some sort of issue that they needed to get on top of. And it would be the less sophisticated companies that would be the ones who I engage with. But it actually turned out to be the opposite, which is actually kind of good for the companies I'm working with, but the ones I'm not, it's even scarier because the companies I work with understand there is a challenge, understand there's a problem to be solved, understand there are risks, and they are, very forward leaning about their use of AI tools, understanding that they need to get a handle on it internally, have policies, procedures, and have a governance program. The companies that don't that I don't work with, or the ones that decide not to work with us, I think they view themselves as saying, hey, we're just beginning our AI journey, like we need to figure out what our what AI tools we're going to use, and then we'll focus on governance. Which I always advise. I would say don't focus on the tools first. Focus on the business objectives before anything. Like before you talk to me, understand what your business goals are. You need to have those in place. Okay, once you've determined that, then have a governance structure in place to make sure that your approach to deploying tools and technologies is responsible, is secure, is compliant. So that would be my recommendation, is to by all means determine your business case first, but don't just go right to tools and then say, hey, we're gonna staple on security, compliance, privacy on the back end.
Yeah, actually, that you said something that made me think of something as well, which is, we love our acronyms in cyber, first off. And one is FUD. Like, initially, like a lot of security professionals are like, oh, they're kind of reverting to the office of no, like, you can't touch it. It's too dangerous. It's too risky. The business is off doing what the business is going to do anyways. But the other one is FOMO. And the business gets FOMO. They say all their peers are adopting this technology. We got to do this. And it's like they don't have a business case or use cases aligned perfectly well in terms of what they want to actually accomplish or what kind of objectives or outcomes they're trying to achieve. So I think that's a big thing that a lot of organizations overlook. When it comes to AI governance too, we're working in this space, and we've seen a lot of credentials like certifications. You can kind of educate us on this too. But like, what are some of the ones that you're seeing right away, like ISO standards and things like that? I know you've been talking about even partnerships now with 3PAOs that you're kind of fostering. Now you've kind of ventured down this path. Now, how's that space shaping up in terms of certifications or things that organizations seek out to kind of prove and demonstrate their level of assurance, for example?
Yeah, there are two AI specific certifications at the organizational level that I'd like to talk about. One is ISO 42001. ISO 42001 is very similar to 27001 in terms of its structure. It's different in terms of its focus area. So it is not primarily a security standard, although it does have requirements for security and privacy and things like that. It is a responsible AI governance standard. And my company, StackAware, is one of the first ISO 42001 certified organizations in the world. We did get that certification done through Shellman, which is also one of our partners, as you alluded to, along with two other firms that are accredited to give ISO 42001 certifications, and those are A-Line and Mastermind. So ISO 42001 is a higher level AI governance standard. And from a compliance perspective, it's interesting because it's one of the first standards with respect to AI that I've seen where governments are actually specifically calling it out and saying that if you are in compliance with the standard, you will have certain safe harbor provisions. It's not a get out of jail free ticket by any stretch of the imagination. But for example, Colorado, in their SB 205 bill that was signed into law, they will grant certain safe harbor provisions under 42001. A broader question is the EU. Will 42001 become a harmonized standard under that law? Some folks are raising some doubts just based on how I understand bureaucracies and governments to work. I think it eventually will become a harmonized standard, which will give you a presumption of conformity in certain situations. So that's 42001. A separate standard that is substantially different from 42001, but related, is the high trust AI security. I'm blanking on the precise name because it has evolved, but the AI high trust AI security certification. This builds on existing high trust certifications for companies that are using that standard, and it is a highly prescriptive, security focused standard. It's publicly available. They took public comments, of which I gave several, and they've been super engaged and receptive to feedback from the community. So that's something I've been quite impressed by in the way that they've operated. ISO is a world-renowned and respected organization. It is a large one. It is an older one, and it has certain bureaucratic speeds at which it moves. High trust is, I'd say, the exact opposite. Like those guys, they move fast, and I really appreciate that. And I have collaborated with them a little bit on the AI security certification. So that is much more focused on the technical side of things, implementing specific controls for protecting data confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Whereas ISO 42001, higher level, focuses on the management system, less so specific AI tools and technologies.
Yeah, you said something there I wanted to ask. It made me think of a comment you made in the beginning about your pivot is, you would work with organizations and they would say, we really want to work with you, but we're trying to get through this compliance or this audit and actually shared a piece recently. I don't know if you've had a chance to check it out, but I think you'd enjoy it. It's called Blessed Are the Lawyers, for they will inherit cybersecurity. And it talks about how increasingly cybersecurity is becoming, the world of legal liability, compliance, regulation, things like that. And as you talked about, it's even driving, kind of things in the AI space with, things like safe harbor, and so on. What is your thoughts around, compliance versus security? Because it seems that we're starting to see compliance is actually the primary forcing function that gets an organization to take security and governance and things like these quite seriously.
It's definitely true. It's definitely true that compliance drives security in many cases. I would say that my opinion is that regulators should focus on outcomes, less so on inputs. And that's because it's so difficult to get frameworks approved, to get legal requirements in place. I worked on Capitol Hill as a staffer and I wrote a bill in like 2016 that was passed in 2018. And it was like the most garden variety bill. Like, no, there was literally no opposition to it. It was just basically telling the Department of Homeland Security to consolidate its data sources, which no one was opposed to. And that took 2 years to get through. So like, that gives you an idea of the speed at which regulation moves. And my suggestions and what I've written publicly is that if regulators focus more on the outcomes and the outputs and penalize and reward organizations accordingly, then they don't really need to get too much into the details of, did you do X, did you do Y, did you do Z? Because the appropriate X, Y, and Z can change quite quickly over time, based on the threat environment, based on understanding of best practices. For a long time, NIST did just reverse itself, but they had been recommending regular password changes, which I think we all understand is not really good from a hygiene perspective, unless you have knowledge of compromise of a password. That actually just creates patterns and makes it easier to predict what someone's password is. But that was codified into, NIST standards are not binding, with some exceptions, but that was codifying bad practice into a standard that a regulator would say, okay, you need to follow the, this NIST control. And then a company would be locked into doing this thing that doesn't make any sense. We also see this with FedRAMP. They require, use of CVSS as a risk rating. That's in their documentation. You can look at it. When the CVSS standard says this is not a risk rating, the NVD says CVSS is not a risk rating. So you can lock organizations into these weird positions where they're like, I understand this is not the right thing to do from a security perspective, but we got to do it anyway. So that's my perspective there. I'll just pause there because I've been talking a while. So I'll turn.
Yeah, no, I agree with that take, and a couple of things that you said. I actually had a guest on last week, James Dempsey from IAPP, which funny enough, we'll be talking about IAPP in a moment here.
Yeah.
But he's the managing director of the new cybersecurity lawfare center that they stood up there, and he actually talked about this as well as outcome focused regulation, and then also the need for actual practitioner driven policy development, so that things that you must do X, Y, and Z, like they actually make sense. And they're driven by practitioners with real world experience, for example. Another question I've been thinking about is, like you, I've been trying to keep up, and many organizations, of course, are trying to keep up around AI governance, AI security, and learn as much as we can, because it's a really complex space. It's changing very quickly, as you know, and there's so much out there from OWASP, CNCF, Cloud Security Alliance, like the list goes on and on and on. Like, how do you recommend organizations, like where and how did they get started? There's so much to pull from. What are some of your key sources? You've got the NIST RMF AI, you got the OWASP LLM top 10, OWASP AI Exchange, Cloud Security Alliance has a whole slew of documents from working groups over there. It's a lot. Like, and if you're not focusing on this full time, like it could be overwhelming and intimidating.
So as someone who does focus on this full time, it's overwhelming and intimidating. So I currently have a structured database with 1,000 rows in it that are just external security references. And I am continuously adding to that database. And I need to have a mapping that uses like multiple Postgres SQL tables to like line up what are the frameworks? What are the sources? What are the implementation requirements? What are the compliance standards like ISO 42001 and 27001? So it is extremely intimidating. And I agree, it's easy to get overwhelmed. What I have tried to do is StackAware maintains a free database that you can just enter your email address to check it out, where I've basically consolidated all this stuff into a list of frameworks, a list of definitions of AI, because it depends on what standard you're talking about, what qualifies as AI, and then also a list of risks. So I've kind of gone through and tried to get the best of the best of all these different resources and put them in a somewhat consolidated database. So obviously plug to that, but there are a lot of good folks out there, good thinkers. I know Steve Wilson at XBeam has been doing a lot of good work there. Itamar Golan, he's a partner of StackAware, full disclosure, but he's done a lot of good work and discussion on the topic. So yeah, I think those are good sources to look at. There's a lot out there though.
Yeah, it definitely can be overwhelming, and ironically enough, it's almost like AI can be a tool to help us, summarize and synthesize all the information that we need to learn from around AI governance and security, because it's really great for those kind of use cases. So I also wanted to ask you, you've made some pretty bold stances publicly around governments, regulation, compliance, things like that. And when it comes to AI, we're kind of seeing this continued trend of, in the United States, we have efforts like the NIST AI RMF, we have the Cyber EO for AI, we have, Secure by Design, which, touches on AI to some extent. These are all very kind of like voluntary best practices, recommendation, driven type stuff, where in the EU, it's a much more rigorous approach with, product liability, the EU AI Act, what are your thoughts on these different approaches that we're seeing evolve, and some of the pros and cons? Because I think there's definitely pros and cons to each that need to be considered, basically.
Yeah. So I agree there are pros and cons to each approach. In the EU is attempting, in my opinion, to become a regulatory superpower. And I'm cribbing that language from someone on X who I forget whose name it is. So whoever that is, yes, you came up with that phrase. I forget who it is. They are attempting to become a regulatory superpower. Now, when you have the United States, which is, even more than 5 years ago, I think you could say the trajectory of the United States as the world economic superpower has accelerated from even 5 years ago. Even when you're looking at, even China, like a rising economic power like that, I still think like they might be petering out a little bit in terms of their growth, and definitely compared to Europe. There's a lot of data on how productivity in the United States has increased massively over the past 20 years compared to Europe. So, it's fine if you've got this economic superpower that is basically generally aligned to you, that has a lot of like cultural ties to you from the European perspective. And frankly, they do kind of just draft off the US a little bit. And, I'm just calling it like it is. Nothing against them. So when all of the innovation is coming from somewhere else, it's much easier to regulate it, in my opinion. Now, in the United States, I'm not saying we're perfect. We're far from it. You mentioned some federal level things. I think, the Biden administration's EO on artificial intelligence, I think I would consider that to be a dead letter by, January 20th. It's gone. So, just calling it like it is. Like, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's what it is. That will certainly be revoked on January 20th. That primarily impacts federal government agencies, but it also does have some impacts on industries that are subject to the Defense Production Act requirements. So basically reporting on some of the security measures around some of these frontier models, physical locations even of some of the processing going on. But I think the new administration will likely bring in or advocate for some national security related executive orders or potentially even legislation around AI, specifically, preventing China from gaining access to certain types of technologies. So I think we'll see that. Where the U.S. is basically, a laggard, and I think we could use a lot of help here, even though this would actually hurt the StackAware business model, because it would reduce the regulatory compliance framework that people need to deal with, would be having a national AI governance. And I would just say jam in their data privacy law, because right now we've got 50 different states, 50 different data privacy laws, and it's a mess. Like, no one likes this. Privacy people don't like it. Business people don't like it. We need to have a consolidated law that preempts the state law to the extent that it's constitutional, and have a consolidated way of managing data privacy, managing AI governance, because otherwise we're just going to have this huge sprawl of 50 different states. And, there may be some benefits from a federalism perspective, but I think this is one area where I would advocate for consolidated federal action in the US.
Yeah, several things you said there I want to touch on is, like I said, I had James Dempsey on last week. He talked about the similar perspective that you just laid out. He thinks the new administration is going to be a much more of a kind of a deregulatory approach, especially in the consumer space around tech and AI, maybe much different in the national security space, like you just pointed out for China and other countries where it'll be a bit more serious and rigorous. And, to your comment about the EU becoming a regulatory superpower, I think that's true, right? They have the most rigorous regulation around data privacy and AI and things like that, but arguably that's actually impacting their ability to be an economic superpower, which is quite the conundrum. And then also, the fact that we talked about compliance is a driver of security, so it's almost a double-edged sword. Where if we see a loosening or kind of a more relaxed approach around compliance, will we unfortunately perhaps see a more haphazard outcome when it comes to security and digital resilience, for example, of the ecosystem. And then the last piece is that the patchwork quilt of regulation in the absence of federal level regulation around data privacy and liability, perhaps, and AI. We got to navigate this complex maze of all the different states and their requirements, and it's a mess. It's a big mess, and it puts so much burden on business and commercial industry to kind of navigate that. So I want to ask as well. You went. We talked about OWASP, AI, and Cloud Security Alliance and others like that. But more on a personal front, when we look at practitioners who are trying to up level and learn and develop in this space, you went and achieved a certification from IIPP, if I'm not mistaken, around AI governance. I'm curious. What was that like? What did you learn? Did you have kind of a good confidence going in because you already been so focused on this problem? And what can other practitioners lean into to kind of get some credentials and experience in this domain?
Yeah, what I'd say is that this is probably one of the most popular topics in cybersecurity is certifications or no certifications. I will say that certifications are a good way to validate or to prove that you have certain types of experience. It's very difficult to walk out of a certification exam, assuming you pass, and then go and start putting hands on keyboard and getting stuff done. So there is definitely value in having a credential that is understood, that is quality controlled, that has some sort of body like IAPP that is overseeing it. At the same time, I admit I am the worst of all of this. Like, I have been for much of my life obsessed with shiny objects and credentials and things like that. And going through the process has its uses, and studying for tests and things like that. The whole point of a test is to get you to study, in my opinion, so that you actually have the knowledge. But it's important to realize that, the practical knowledge, the practical application, that's what really matters. And, I did a post on this, which I think you're referring to, is that I did 15 minutes of studying for the IAPP exam, and actually I did not have a great score, just to be frank. But it's a binary thing, and I passed. And my whole goal was saying, like, hey, I've been immersed in this for a year, and like, if I can't pass this exam, then there's something wrong with me, most likely, or there's something wrong with the exam. But I think neither turned out to be true. And I would just say certifications are a tool in the toolkit, but for those who are just coming up, don't over-index on them.
Yeah, it's funny. I see so many parallels between personal certifications, like you just talked about, and compliance certifications. For example, essentially it's a signal among many in terms of competence or an emphasis around experience or expertise in a certain domain. It doesn't mean that you know all things or you're flawless. Same from the compliance perspective. It doesn't mean your organization has no issues and security is totally solved. But it's certainly a signal to the external world of you've taken this seriously and you put in some work to kind of achieve this credential. So I want to ask as we come to the end of the chat here, obviously we have stackaware.com. Folks can learn more. What's coming on the horizon for you? Like what's next? I've seen some announcements with you and 3PAOs, which is amazing. I think it's really cool that you're, especially as a small business owner, fostering those relationships with these big 3PAOs of the world. What's next for you and the team?
Yeah, so would love to expand the team. Certainly, there is one candidate, if he's listening, who I would love to hire. It's really just a matter of money, frankly. Like, don't have enough yet. We're on the horizon for for hitting that level, depending on how many deals we close. End of 2024 is going to be big. It could be a really big end of the year. And if that's the case, then we'll look at bringing on a relatively senior person to basically take over a lot of the service delivery, move me into more of a go to market, sales marketing type role, product strategy. We do have a product that is available. It is currently basically you only have two tiers. There's free 7-day trial, or there's like for our existing consulting clients, we give them access as part of the engagement. That's the StackAware Risk Assessment API. It has a whole set of off-the-shelf assessments that you can pull in via just a post request and a key that we give you. So eventually would like to move into more of a product company, but we are focused primarily right now on the services side of things. As I mentioned, that is the way you understand so deeply those customer problems is by solving those problems for them. And it's not scalable. I agree it's not scalable. But I'm a fan of Alex Hormozy, he's a business influencer, and he talks a lot about, hey, it's not unscalable, it's unskillable. Like, you don't have the skills to scale it. So working on those skills, along the way, potentially we could scale this business broader and broader. So, and then on a kind of more technical or more detailed perspective, we are looking at moving into the high trust space, because high trust is not just healthcare, and they would be very insistent that it's not just healthcare, but there is a big historical presence in healthcare with high trust, and we're seeing a lot of overlap between customers with that are AI powered healthcare companies. So that's something we're looking hard at moving into in the next year.
Yeah, I think you're going to do great. Obviously, you have the work ethic. You've shown that you're willing to kind of pivot and be dynamic and move where the market goes. It's the right time, right technology. I think we're early innings, obviously, when it comes to AI governance and security. And on the healthcare comment, I actually just shared a report from Menlo Ventures, a venture, capital company, that showed that some of their biggest early adopters is actually these highly regulated environments like healthcare and legal, who are typically laggards to new technology. So I think you're onto something there, and so is high trust, if I had to guess. So that said, Walter, man, thanks so much for coming on. StackAware.com, folks, you can check it out and follow Walter online on LinkedIn. He puts out a great amount of information around AI governance and security, and I always learn a lot from it, and appreciate to everyone who tuned in as well.
Thanks a lot, Chris.